Good afternoon. I'm Alan Price, Director of the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum. And on behalf of all my library and foundation colleagues, I'm delighted to welcome all of you who are watching this afternoon's program online, as well as those of you who are with us here in person today. To open, I humbly start with a land acknowledgment to recognize the indigenous tribes of the Pawtucket and Massachusetts peoples of the Wampanoag Tribal Confederation territories, who, both past and present and through many generations, have stewarded the land where the Kennedy Library sits today. While the land acknowledgement is not enough, it is an important way to promote indigenous visibility, and it serves as a reminder that we are on stolen and settled indigenous lands. I invite all of us to contemplate how to better support indigenous communities and to learn how to honor and take care of the land that each of us inhabits. I would like to acknowledge the generous support of our underwriters of the Kennedy Library Forums, lead sponsors Bank of America, the Lowell Institute, and AT&T, and our media sponsor, the Boston Globe. I would like to thank Timothy Naftali, New York University professor of public service and of history, for serving as an advisor in the development of this conference. Thank you also to our archives staff for research and digitization assistance in support of this program, particularly James Hill and Mary Rose Grossman. Special thank you to Ambassador Caroline Kennedy for permission to use the audio from Mrs. Kennedy's 1964 oral history interview. And thank you to Kennedy Library Director of Education and Public Programs, Nancy McCoy, for her contributions to this conference, and forum producer Liz Murphy for her extensive and extraordinary work to bring this program to you today. We would thank you if you would just silence your cell phones. We look forward to a robust question and answer period following the program this afternoon. You'll see full instructions on screen for submitting your questions via email or comments on our YouTube page during the program. And when the Q&A begins, we will invite those of you who are joining us here in person today to proceed to the microphones, which are in the aisles, as you ask your questions. We are so grateful to have this opportunity to explore the Cuban Missile Crisis and how its lessons resonate with contemporary challenges 60 years later. I'm now honored to introduce this session's distinguished speakers briefly so that there is more time for the conversation. A warm virtual welcome to Daniel Ellsberg. Since the Vietnam War, he has been a lecturer, scholar, writer, and activist on the dangers of the nuclear era, wrongful U.S. interventions, and the urgent need for patriotic whistleblowing. As an analyst for the RAND Corporation, he worked on the top secret study on the U.S. and Vietnam, which later became known as the Pentagon Papers, which he ultimately gave to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and 17 other newspapers. His subsequent trial on 12 felony counts was dismissed in 1973 on grounds of governmental misconduct against him, leading to the convictions of several White House aides and figuring in the impeachment proceedings against President Nixon. He's the author of 4 books, including most recently, The Doomsday Machine: Confessions of a Nuclear War Planner. It is also a pleasure to welcome Nancy Kane to the library virtually. She is a historian at the Harvard Business School, where she holds the James E. Robeson Chair of Business Administration. Her research focuses on crisis leadership and how leaders and their teams rise to the challenges of high-stakes situations. The author of numerous books, articles, and Harvard Business School cases, her most recent book is Forged in Crisis: The Power of Courageous Leadership in Turbulent Times. I'm also delighted to welcome Mary Sarotte back to the library virtually. An expert in the history of international relations, she is the inaugural holder of the Marie José and Henry R. Kravis Distinguished Professorship of Historical Studies at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, as well as a research associate at Harvard University's Center for European Studies. She is the author or editor of 6 books, including most recently, Not 1 Inch, America, Russia, and the Making of the Post-Cold War Stalemate. I'm very pleased to welcome Philip Zelikow virtually, the White Burkett Miller Professor of History at the University of Virginia. He has also served at all levels of American government. Since leaving regular government service in 1991, he has taught and directed research programs at Harvard University and at the University of Virginia, and is the author of numerous books. While in academia, he has remained engaged with public service, including his current leadership of the privately sponsored COVID Commission Planning Group, and public service leadership to direct the 9/11 Commission and to serve as the counselor of the Department of State. I am very glad to welcome back to the library Timothy Naftali, a clinical associate professor of public service and a clinical associate professor of history at NYU, as well as a CNN presidential historian. He writes on national security and intelligence policy, international history, and presidential history, and his work has appeared in numerous national media outlets. He previously served as the founding director of the Richard Nixon Presidential Library and Museum in Yorba Linda, California. Tim, thank you so much for serving as both panelist and moderator for this session, and thank you again for all your contributions to make today's conversations possible. Please join me in welcoming our special guests.
Thank you, Alan, and thank you here in person, and those of you who are watching on the web. This is something you're going to witness, sort of something that only the pandemic could have created, which is one person sitting on a stage who appears to contain multitudes, and 4 people who are joining us from various parts of this country, and in Mary's case, the world. I want to, before we hear from my colleagues who are virtually participating, I'd like to set the scene for you. In addition to what you heard as you came in, I'd like you to listen to President Kennedy talking about what he, at the beginning of the crisis, the public part of the crisis, which is the president's speech on October 22nd, what he expected from Khrushchev to end this crisis. So let's go with the first clip, please, from the president's speech of October 22nd.
I call upon Chairman Khrushchev to halt and eliminate this clandestine, reckless, and provocative threat to world peace and to stable relations between our 2 nations. I call upon him further to abandon this course of world domination and to join in an historic effort to end the perilous arms race and to transform the history of man. He has an opportunity now to move the world back from the abyss of destruction by returning to his government's own words that it had no need to station missiles outside its own territory, and withdrawing these weapons from Cuba, by refraining from any action which will widen or deepen the present crisis, and then by participating in a search for peaceful and permanent solutions.
I've asked each of our participants to start with about 5 minutes of thoughts about the crisis, their own study of the crisis, as a way of introducing a general discussion among us before we open the floor to questions from all of you. So I'd like to call on Phil Zelikow to start with his 5-minute or so presentation. Welcome, Phil. Philip, can you stop for a minute, please? We're having a little trouble with the audio here in the room. I'm going to ask folks if they can raise the volume, pump up the volume, please, because otherwise I'm going to have to lip read. I know Philip well. Like he was my boss, and I've learned a lot from his writings. But I don't want to second guess him, and don't want to get it wrong. and don't want to say things that Philip actually isn't saying. So if we could increase the volume, that would be great. Otherwise, this really will be a one-person show, and it shouldn't be. Well, have we got a sense of how we might increase this? Of course, what we don't want to do is blow the eardrums out of the people who are watching or listening to this. Oh, that could be good news. Philip, you want to start again, please?
Sure. Can you hear me now?
We certainly can. Thank goodness. Oh, my goodness. I was just wondering if I'd have to lip read. Go ahead, Philip, please.
I'll just take a few minutes to talk about the way our evaluations of President Kennedy's role in the crisis have changed. I experienced the crisis as a school child. I later came to know it a lot better over the years, not just through research, but because, like Tim and I have, through the time machine of the tapes, have spent actually more time in the Kennedy White House than almost any member of the Kennedy administration ever did.
Might be true.
And not just on Cuban Missile Crisis meetings, but of meetings and phone calls of all kinds on every subject. And actually, not just going to the meetings once, but often going to the same meeting again and again and again. So we do feel like later in life, we got to know these people astonishingly well, as if we had traveled back through a time machine to be with them there in 1962 and then repeat the experience. So let me just carve this up into three phases. The first phase is the phase in which President Kennedy was widely perceived as having played a heroic role in resolving the crisis, dramatized in TV dramas like The Missiles of October, where William Devane played President Kennedy, and also the account that his brother wrote in 13 Days. President Kennedy seen as having played this decisive, courageous, heroic role in striking the right balance. And that image carried forward, I would say, pretty well through the 1970s and maybe into the 1980s. It came under concerted attack from many angles during the 1980s and on into the 1990s. The attack was it was part of the general attack that was trying to shatter the myth of Camelot. And from a lot of different perspectives, including President Kennedy's personal life. But second, it was a critique that the myth of American strength in the crisis was actually a dangerous myth. That not only was it wrong, it was dangerous. That it was dangerous to have sought and accepted a nuclear crisis just over an issue of credibility, that he was threatening the world because of his own macho sensibilities in not accepting a missile deployment that should not have bothered him, a sense that the whole myth of Kennedy's resolution of the crisis was part of the bravado that then encouraged Americans to plunge into the intervention in Vietnam, and that Kennedy had manipulated the press so as to make the peacemakers like Adlai Stevenson look bad, and that they had concealed the role of assurances about Jupiter missiles in Turkey and resolving the crisis, again, to create this artificial image of strength. So that there was this then very strong countervailing view. But the third phase of this, in which Tim and I have taken direct part, from the 1990s on in 2000s, is yet a further reevaluation. And I think those of us who most connected with the Tapes Project, in general, come away with it with a generally more positive image of President Kennedy's leadership. And that doesn't mean that we're not aware of all the challenges to the Camelot myth. We understand those very well. What we came away with is first that the crisis was both more complex and more dangerous than people at the time had generally realized, in part because of how closely the crisis was related to the supreme and quite dangerous superpower confrontation over Berlin, and the level of what Dan Ellsberg might regard as almost nuclear insanity. That was the conventional wisdom of the age driving the strategies on both sides. And very much including our posture as to how to deal with the Berlin crisis, where the United States was defending Berlin by threatening to be the ones who would start the nuclear war, which was one of the things that Khrushchev kept finding so astonishing and arrogant, and which we think helped prompt him to put the missiles in Cuba to puncture that American arrogance. So if you understand how complex and dangerous the crisis was, also the folks who worked with this a lot tended to realize how little help in some ways Kennedy got in solving a lot of problems in this particular crisis, which many of us think was actually his finest hour in government. That a lot of the people who had written about the crisis were not actually that people like Sorensen, Schlesinger, had not actually been deeply informed about what had happened in many ways during the crisis. The roles of people like Bob McNamara had not been very constructive. And actually, his national security advisor, McGeorge Bundy, did not really provide a lot of effective help in the crisis. And so therefore, as we studied this more and more, we came away with a sense that in many ways it was on President Kennedy's shoulders alone to provide some of the clinical empathy that allowed him to think about what Khrushchev might be thinking and to help navigate a way out of the crisis, along with the role of some people who at the early years were not very well known or heralded, like the career diplomat Llewellyn Thompson, known to his colleagues as Tommy Thompson, who is not a well-known figure, but who I think President Kennedy regarded as perhaps his most important single advisor in the crisis. So let me stop there as just to introduce these changing portraits, from the heroic portrait to the very powerful revisionist critique, to then a further reevaluation as we've gotten to understand the crisis in a much richer way.
Thank you, Philip. I think it would be useful at this point to see how John F. Kennedy described his decision-making process when interviewed about it in December of 1962, only a few months after the Cuban Missile Crisis. Can we have the next clip, please?
Well, Mr. President, that brings up a point that's always interested me. How does a president go about making a decision, like Cuba, for example?
The most recent one was hammered out really our policy and decision over a period of 5 or 6 days. During that period, the 15 people, more or less, who were directly consulted frequently changed their view because whatever action we took had so many disadvantages to it. And each action that we took raised the prospect that it might escalate with the Soviet Union into a nuclear war. Finally, however, I think a general consensus developed and certainly seemed, after all alternatives were examined, that the course of action that we finally adopted was the right one.
I'd like to ask Nancy, who thinks a lot about crisis leadership, Nancy Kane, to tell us what she thinks, please.
Thanks, Tim, and thanks, Phil. It's always so interesting to hear your very, very well-informed and wise thoughts. I am writing a case for the Harvard Business School about John Kennedy, but it's actually about his use of his emotional intelligence and his emotional awareness and his self-discipline or self-regulation during these pivotal days. And I didn't know a great deal about Kennedy in this context. I've studied other leaders like Nelson Mandela or John Lewis or Abraham Lincoln in this context, but I really didn't know very much about Kennedy as a user of emotional tools that have external impact. And then I found myself, to a much lesser degree than you, Tim, and than you, Phil, buried in the transcripts. I spent about 6 or 7 months reading them and then rereading them one more time. Now, again, not in the form you did, but in the 3 large published volumes. And here's what emerged for me, and it's still emerging, but here's what's so striking to me. Kennedy actually was in many ways a superlative practitioner of using a series of insight about himself, emotional insights about himself, and about the people who advised him, and what Phil referred to as clinical empathy, I might call it calculated empathy, applying that to Khrushchev and the larger situation. He really relied on a series of tools, I think, or behaviors, we might say, that are really quite important. And the first I would mention, and again, Kennedy is not the only leader to have done this in a high-stakes situation, but the first one was a kind of consistent forbearance, right? This ability to, hold himself back, if you will, or to forbear doing something in the moment, in the heat, because the temperature mostly rose during those pivotal 13 days, in the heat, and in the, in some ways, very aggressive and strident energies of some of his advisors, and not just at all times, his military advisors. And he consistently, at least from day 2 on, from that first Wednesday on, just really holds himself back from that, right? Really doesn't take a variety of baits, both external and internal to the XCOM, that are coming at him. And that's a very difficult thing to do, and yet, from Lincoln to Churchill to Katharine Graham at the Washington Post in the early 1970s, it's a really important tool, and I think he relies on it in a lot of different ways. The second thing that I have noticed is that Kennedy, like Lincoln was the greatest practitioner I found of this tool. He used this ability to detach himself, like, moment by moment, at the end of the day, in the middle of the day, across the most intense days of the crisis, literally detach himself from what was going on in the immediacy of the decisions he was to make or the debates he was listening to. And he kept returning to a kind of larger picture, evolving picture on what was happening, revising it, and editing it, and make it as new evidence, as new information came in. So that ability to remove yourself from the fray is incredibly important, and he's very good at it. The third thing I would say is an old-fashioned word, and again, stealing from Lincoln, from something Lincoln said in 1862 at the end of a bad year for the Union armies. He said, the dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. As our case is new, so we must think anew and act anew. And then later in this speech, which was an address to Congress, he uses this concept of disenthralling ourselves from the immediacy, from older ways of thinking about things. And I think Kennedy did that too. Not in the sense of abandoning, political considerations or abandoning, all kinds of very, very important guardrails, touchstones, but he's able at lots of moments. And you can, see this very, very clearly when he in his language. Help me understand what Mr. Khrushchev is thinking. Help me understand this, right? And the way that sense of leading the XCOM and without taking this on as a mano kind of verbal or energetic struggle in the room, in the cabinet room, being able to keep kind of looking at this thing from a variety of angles. And I think this aspect, disenthralling, is really important to something Phil just mentioned, this clinical empathy, this ability to kind of keep on understanding how do I look at what Khrushchev is going on. So clinical, calculated empathy, really, really quite important. And the last thing I might say here, and then I'll just stop, is that he uses these different emotional tools, and I think some others as well. They're part, not the whole, kind of arsenal, but they're part of the tools he uses to control pace or to influence pace and to move back and forth in influencing the distance between him and his XCOM, but more important, the distance between him and Nikita Khrushchev. And he does that in a lot of different ways that folks around this room or this Zoom call and in the Kennedy Library understand very, very well. But the use of those, distance and pace, rely very heavily on this ability to summon one's emotional awareness and intelligence and one's self-regulation to move forward, to make decisions, and to keep this environment of what he really tried to sustain as productive dialogue, all right, in place. So let me stop there, Tim.
Thank you, Nancy. And one of the, of course, challenges when you're engaging in decision-making is that you need to be sure you know enough. And even if you don't know enough, you have to make a decision. Our next clip is of a conversation involving Robert McNamara, I believe here, where he's talking about what he and the president and the rest of the ex-com were trying to achieve and what they didn't know. Let's go to the next clip, please.
He was determined to try to avoid war in connection with the Cuban Missile Crisis. Neither he nor others of us knew how dangerous that situation was. We knew it was dangerous, but we didn't know that at the time at 4 p.m. on Saturday, October 26th, the critical hour of the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the chiefs recommended unanimously to attack. Nobody in the room knew that at that moment of time, when the CIA was estimating, there were no nuclear warheads on the soil of Cuba. We had photographs of the missiles, but no nuclear warheads there. It wasn't until 23 years later we learned there were 170 nuclear warheads there, roughly, 60 or 70 tactical to be used against an invasion fleet, 90 or so to be used on the missiles targeted on 90 million Americans on the East Coast. But he was so determined to keep the nation out of war, if at all possible, he avoided those risks. And that was a major, major foundation to his thinking.
Our next participant was in the Pentagon during the missile crisis. Dan Ellsberg. Dan, it is an honor and a privilege to have you participating today. Dan, you are muted. For the first time in your life, you are muted.
Not the first time. My wife would love to have a button like that. We've just heard my former boss, Secretary McNamara, make a reasonably long statement that was quite accurate. We're unusually privileged on that, actually. And something that was very unusual for a former official to say, we were mistaken in what we believed at this particular time when I was in office. The message that went out to people announcing this conference had a map in it, which I first saw on the first day I was back in the Pentagon. That was Tuesday, October 23rd, the day after the president's speech. Like some of the rest of you, I watched that speech from my home in California, Malibu, California. I had no precursor of it. I was particularly struck by one statement that was made, that a single nuclear warhead, of which he implied there were a number already in the Caribbean, against the United States or anyone else in Latin America, would result in a full retaliatory response against the Soviet Union. And I thought, that's a pretty strong statement. I wonder if the person writing that knows exactly what he was saying. And almost surely he didn't. It was Sorensen. I doubt very much. I know pretty much who knew what. I doubt very much what Sorensen knew. What I had learned just a year before, working for McNamara and for the White House, that full retaliatory response to one missile, in other words, an attack which had not degraded our own ability to carry out our operation plans, the Eisenhower operation, was estimated by the Joint Chiefs of Staff in an answer to President Kennedy, would kill 600 million people. 100 million in Europe, our allies. Depending on which way the wind blew, from our own warheads landing in East Europe carrying radioactivity. But actually, the Russians did have a lot of MRBMs, IRBMs, medium-range missiles, and bombers, short-range bombers that we couldn't detect. And whatever we did would be sure to annihilate our allies, whichever way the wind blew. So Kennedy was saying that a single warhead will lead to the annihilation of our NATO allies. Also, 100 million in areas contiguous to the Soviet Union, 100 million in East Europe, and between Russia and China, where every city over 25,000 was targeted by SAC. Every city over 25,000. 325 million would be killed by the immediate blast, fire, and short-range radioactivity. So that was a pretty strong threat against one, and I wondered, they ought to cool it on that. That was one thought I had. But I called up my friend and former boss in the Pentagon, Harry Rowan, who was an Assistant Secretary of Defense, a Deputy Secretary of Defense, under Assistant Secretary Paul Nitze, who was famous for having almost invented the Cold War with his NSC 68 document under Atchison and Truman. And I asked Harry if he needed some help there. I had just been in the Pentagon, as I say, writing new guidance for war plans. It would kill fewer than 600 million. That was a low bar, much too low in retrospect. Impossible to do that. But I ended up with a catastrophic war plan anyway. But I asked him, do you need some help there, given what obviously was being presented by the president as a major crisis? He said, why don't you take the next plane? And I took an early plane on Tuesday morning, got there Tuesday afternoon, and was shown a map almost identical to the one that your program presented. A map of the Caribbean area with two circles centered on Havana. And one is about, as I recall, 1,100 miles, 700 to 11, and another was about 2,000 miles, the 700 for the MRBM. What targets could we reach? And I was asked this because I was one of the people in the country who, on the basis of his head, knew where the targets were, knew what a Soviet attack should look like. That's what I've been working on for years, young as I was then. And could see right away that, yes, several SAC bases were covered even by the MRBM. It's obviously Miami and a few others were close to Cuba, but specifically the MRBM could hit Washington, D.C., and Offutt Air Force Base, which is command center of SAC, Strategic Air Command. The 2,000 or 2,200 mile missile, the IRBM, which in fact never did arrive thanks to the blockade. But sites were there for it, and as far as we knew, they had IRBMs. Could cover almost the entire United States. And I was asked what 38 missiles of those, that was the figure we were using, not far from the accurate, would do to our security, to our defense. In particular, did it give them a first strike capability that they certainly didn't have at that time? The answer was, didn't take too long to write it in my own mind. No, it doesn't change the situation significantly. In comparison to what the situation was to begin with, the ability of these missiles didn't add to it that very much, not significantly more than corresponding 38 missiles or 40 missiles of ICBM range in Russia. Now, these missiles could go faster, much faster, to decapitate Washington or Offutt, and the Air Force would certainly take note of that. But they already had submarines at sea with cruise missiles that could deliver a no-warning attack on those bases. And thereby the president had very secretly delegated the authority to other commanders, regional commanders. If communications were cut off, such an attack took place, they would follow their own advice. They had plans for this and carry out the attack. So the Soviet Union would in no way be spared any damage by such an attack, and it did not affect the strategic situation. Now, that was me. I was young at that point. There were at that point, as Harry told me, about 3 or 4 working groups working under the so-called executive committee, the ExComm, which the president was meeting every day, several times. 3 or 4, and I was on 2 of them, the only one that I know of that was on 2, and the only outside consultant that was on any one of them. But I was not at all surprised to learn when the tapes came out almost 40 years later that McNamara had said a week earlier, when asked by the president what the significance of these was almost exactly the same as mine. The bottom line, he said several times, it makes no strategic difference. This is not a military problem. He said that not once, but in the transcripts, time after time, when the subject came up. This is not a military problem. It is a domestic military problem. And the domestic problem arose from the fact that the president had specifically drawn a red line and said, I'm not moving now, as the Republicans were urging him to do against the obvious overt Soviet buildup on the island. I'm not moving now because there's nothing that can reach the United States. But if they were to put this, that would raise the gravest issues. And we would have to do something at that point. He said that on the almost sure assurance that they would not do that. And to his knowledge, which was wrong, they had never done it. CIA didn't know he had done it before in East Germany. Secretly, never told us. Learned it later. So he was sure they wouldn't do that. And as Soren said later, if he thought that they might do that, not that they would, that they might, he would never have made that warning. But given the warning, everyone agreed in McNamara, you have to do something. You can't do nothing. Now, because having said that this would be a grave issue for the United States, which it wasn't, but he'd said that to excuse why what he was not reacting to, the buildup, was not very much. That would be something. Having told the American people that that would be something, he would have to do something. And that was the crisis. And with domestic political crisis, with congressional election coming up in a month, as now, and a presidential coming up in 2 years. Had he done nothing, he believed he would have been impeached. His mother believed so, very likely, but he would not have been president in 1964. And his Republican Senator Keating, who was running, had said on October 10th, before the president learned of the missiles on October 16th, that the missiles were there. And that George Bundy had denied it that Sunday, yesterday, by the count here, and had denied it. And so he would look like a fool. It would have been maximum humiliation for him if he did nothing. And he, as a matter of fact, when he saw the missiles, his first reaction was, this makes Senator Keating president. Now, is it regarded as odd that his first reaction to something like this, which in fact didn't affect the strategic matter very much, was dominated by his worry about the political consequences? No, but I learned in a dozen years in literature was that's the first consideration, and the second consideration, and the third pretty much is a good, which is a big secret from the public, that such decisions of life and death and war and peace are affected at all by domestic political considerations. But that's a secret truth. The upshot of this is that I'm so glad that we're meeting now. I have the honor of meeting with these scholars who've been working on it. I came across that raises the question, why was it so dangerous? It was a military problem, but how dangerous was that? So make two comments. One, President Biden has said in the last couple of weeks. Oh, can you finish? Okay.
No, Dan, I'd like, no, you're great, but could you hold that for our general discussion when we talk about comparing, contrasting?
No, just an analogy, not about Ukraine. The word Ukraine will not.
It can if you want. No, it can. But
you didn't hear it. But his words were, it doesn't involve Ukraine. This is the most dangerous approach to Armageddon, to the final before the second coming, end of the world, since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And of course, the question people are asking, most people weren't alive during that. I'm 91. This took place when I was 30. 2/3 of my life have been spent trying to understand the answer to the question, how dangerous was that? This is the most dangerous since then? Fair enough. How dangerous was that and why? And could it have been made less dangerous and so forth? And that's obviously relevant to the present, whatever it is. And the answer I want to suggest, I came across something I wrote in 1990 after 30 years of 60 years, after 6 years of studying this crisis, in which I participated, as I said, as two working groups, and then followed it because of my concern for the next year on a high level classified interagency crisis to find out why did they think it was that dangerous, and why, and was it? How truthfully was it? And my conclusion was in 1990, we're about midway through our ability to understand the Cuban Missile Crisis. This was after 60 years. 30 years have gone by since then. We're beyond, I think, halfway, but not that far beyond. So whatever we can contribute tonight will be part of that, and there's still a long way to go.
Thank you, Dan. To get a sense of how the president prepared the American people and the world for the level of danger that his decision to push the Soviets to remove missiles, I'd like you to listen to the president on October 22nd, suggesting that this crisis might be a long one and a very dangerous one. Next clip, please, Andrew.
Mr. President, have you noted, since you've been in office, that this terrible responsibility for the fate of mankind has, notwithstanding the differences that divide you, has drawn you and Mr. Khrushchev somewhat closer in this joint sense of responsibility? He seems to betray it, especially in his speech to the Supreme Soviet earlier.
I think that speech this week, he showed his awareness of the nuclear age. But of course, the Cuban effort has made it more difficult for us to carry out any successful negotiations, because this was an effort to materially change the balance of power. It was done in secret. Steps were taken really to deceive us by every means they could. And they were planning in November to open to the world the fact that they had these missiles so close to the United States. Not that they were intending to fire them, because if they were going to get into a nuclear struggle, they have their own missiles in the Soviet Union, but it would have politically changed the balance of power. It would have appeared to, and appearances contribute to reality. So it's going to be some time before it's possible for us to come to any real understandings with Mr. Khrushchev. But I do think his speech shows that he realizes how dangerous a world we live in.
Mary Sarotte, move us back and give us a sense of the international political moment that this crisis occurred in.
Yeah, first, let me say it's an honor to be here. I wish that I could be there in person with you, Tim. I have enjoyed my events at the Kennedy Library very much. But both Daniel Ellsberg and Phil Zelikow have rightly mentioned my current location, which used to be inside East Germany in Berlin. And I've put behind me for this evening a photo of the structure that began going up here about a year before the Cuban crisis, namely the Berlin Wall. Its construction commenced, of course, suddenly in the wee hours of August 13th, 1961. It represented a further hardening of the Cold War front line between the nuclear superpowers. And it's right that both Daniel and Phil have mentioned this, because in a sense, the shadow of this wall stretched all the way to Cuba. It also stretched all the way to Washington. It was on the minds of all of the participants. Was Berlin the point of putting missiles in Cuba? Would Khrushchev demand a trade? West Berlin for the nukes in Cuba? So Berlin and Cuba, even though they are geographically disparate, are obviously very, very tightly linked. Now, we know that war did not break out in Cuba and war did not break out in Berlin. I am not an expert on the Cuban Missile Crisis, so I will leave the details of how we avoided that fate to the other experts on this panel. But I did want to talk, as you said, Tim, about the moment in which we find ourselves and ways in which it is similar and different to the Cuban Missile Crisis. So I'll just briefly toss out 3 similarities and 3 differences, and then we can see where that gets us. So on the similarities to the time period of the Cuban Missile Crisis and now, both times, tragically, we have to think about catastrophic nuclear risk. As someone who was studying abroad in West Berlin in 1989, who personally remembers the sense of hope and optimism at the end of the Cold War, it is heartbreaking to me now, as an older historian, to be coming back to the same fears that haunted my childhood. I remember the film The Day After. I remember when I first studied in Berlin in 1986, it seemed as if the wall would be there forever and the thermonuclear standoff would be there forever. And I remember that feeling of relief when the nuclear saber rattling went away, and now it is back. So then as now, we are talking about a strategic nuclear exchange. Obviously, I hope very much that is a bluff and just rhetoric on Putin's part. Again, these are 3 similarities. There are many more, but I'm not supposed to talk for 7 hours, so I'll just keep it to a few. Then another similarity, of course, is that Moscow and Washington are at odds over a third country. And then it was Cuba, now it is Ukraine. And third, and importantly, this showdown over another country is taking place in the context of a deeper, pervasive hostility. So those are some of the similarities, but there are obviously a number of differences as well. The first is, I think, the difference between the roles that Cuba and Ukraine are playing. Obviously, the war that, as it is unfolding in Ukraine, doesn't really have a parallel in the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cuban troops had not been fighting U.S. troops on their soil for months in the way that the Ukrainians have. And so the weight of the Ukrainians and the amount of say they're going to have in the outcome, I think will be qualitatively different than the role the Cubans have, as Cubans had. As we know, ultimately, when push came to shove, it came down to that critical meeting so vividly portrayed in the film 13 Days, when President Kennedy sends his brother Bobby to talk to the Soviet ambassador. That's really the key moment. And those are the 2 men in the room. Bobby is the proxy for the president, and the Soviet ambassador is the proxy for Khrushchev. And that's where the deal is struck. I don't see Biden and Putin or their representatives having a secret meeting and creating a final resolution to the crisis in Ukraine. The Ukrainians have shed a lot of blood. The Ukrainians are now making clear they want to, for example, go back to the borders of 1991. And I'd like to express my intense admiration for the Ukrainians and how bravely they have been standing up to the unspeakable acts that Putin is committing. So I don't think it's an uneasy fit to try to draw parallels between what was happening in Cuba and what's happening in Ukraine. What's happening in Ukraine now is obviously a major European land war. There was not a major land war going on in Cuba at the same time, and that's an important difference. Another important difference is that President Kennedy, in my opinion, wisely didn't inform the American public the minute he heard about what was happening in Cuba. And this, I think, was smart because, among other things, it gained him time to think. It gained him time to think through options, to some extent to control the pacing of the crisis, not entirely, but to a certain extent. Now things are happening a lot more in real time and a lot more in the public view, especially with social media, both on the battlefront and even in the way that, Zelensky, who is very, very skilled, obviously, using social media and so forth, is getting out information. So I think the pacing is much faster, and I'm not sure if there are actors who are controlling the pacing. I think Putin would like to be controlling the pacing, but he wanted to take Kyiv in 3 days, and that pacing didn't work so well for him, again, thanks to the bravery of the Ukrainians and I believe some fairly well-handled intelligence cooperation with Washington. I have no inside information on that. I'm just guessing from what I read in the papers. But I think that the pacing is very much different. And then also, I think now at the time, the United States, the size of the nuclear arsenals, of course, there was the public fear about the missile gap, that somehow the United States had fewer missiles than the Soviet bloc, but in reality, the missile gap went the other way. Now, obviously, there's no shortage of nuclear weapons in Moscow, and so I think that the weighting of the U.S. versus Moscow is different. So I've been trying to think, as I've been preparing for this event, where does this leave us? And I think the short answer is nowhere good, because I'd like the Cuban Missile Crisis to be a relevant guide, because the Cuban Missile Crisis ended without a nuclear conflict, and I obviously don't want any kind of escalation. And so the challenge now is to stand up to Putin, who is quite obviously a bully who only understands the language of force. Europe is now at war again. That is different than peacetime. It demands different measures. So the challenge is to resist Putin, to support the Ukrainians, and to avoid escalation. Now, we do have experience with that. It was called the Cold War. And so the question is, how do we continue to do that? But I think there's a kind of uneasy fit between the Cuban Missile Crisis and today's crisis. I'm struggling to see the equivalent of that conversation where Bobby Kennedy goes to the Soviet ambassador and they strike a deal which ends the crisis. Now, I know there was a sequel. It took longer for the missiles to get out than believed, and we just heard from McNamara they didn't know just how many actual warheads had gone in. So I know the crisis didn't just disappear immediately, roughly 60 years ago now. But in essence, when push came to shove, the key moment was that it was when Bobby Kennedy spoke to the Soviet ambassador. It's hard to imagine a single key moment like that coming up in the crisis. But if the other panelists, members of the audience, can envision such a moment, I would be very interested to hear that. So I'll stop there, and I'll be interested to hear the discussion.
Thank you, Mary. Nikita Khrushchev had grown up with a sense that the Soviet Union was inferior in terms of strategic power to the United States. That sense of inferiority is very important to understand when trying to explain why he put missiles in Cuba. Historians continue to debate the list of reasons and their priority. One as far as my co-author Alexander Ferzenko and I were concerned, a very important element in explaining Khrushchev's decision, which, by the way, it had to be confirmed by the entire Presidium, it's what they called the Politburo at the time, but it was his idea, was he wanted the Americans to fear the Soviet Union. He wanted to be able to contain American power, and he also wanted to be able to protect Soviet allies, in this case, most importantly, Cuba. But he had this generalized sense of insecurity, and the Soviet intercontinental ballistic missile program had not been as successful as he had hoped. The Soviets there was a missile gap, but it benefited the United States dramatically. And so putting missiles in Cuba, in a sense, was a cure-all. The Soviets and the Cubans had been talking about defending Cuba, and the Soviet military had come up with a conventional package that the Cubans actually were quite satisfied with. The Cubans did not ask for strategic weapons. But the key for Khrushchev was an assessment about Kennedy. And Nancy Kane was talking about empathy. And Khrushchev's mistake was he misunderstood Kennedy. He was convinced of two things. One, that John Kennedy would accept, once he found out about the deployment of Soviet missiles in Cuba, that he would accept that deployment. And two, that the United States, if the Soviets went to the brink of nuclear war, would back down. These are two essential misunderstandings of that moment. When Kennedy drew that red line that Daniel Ellsberg described, that happened in September of 1962. The Soviets hadn't expected that. Now, John Kennedy hadn't expected the Soviets to put missiles in Cuba, and I agree with Dan that John Kennedy drew that line assuming the Soviets would never attempt to cross it. That line was drawn largely for political purposes in the president's mind, the way that President Obama drew two red lines in 2012 during a presidential campaign regarding both Iran and Syria. I wouldn't say that all members of the Kennedy administration thought the way the president did. I think Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General, and John McCone, the Director of Central Intelligence, both actually wanted the president to draw a line to deter the Soviets from doing something that they were afraid he might do. But John Kennedy, I don't think, believed that Khrushchev would ever do that. When Khrushchev learned of the drawing of the red line, it was, after all, intended for him to learn about, instead of backing down, he actually escalates. He decides to send more tactical missiles, nuclear missiles, to Cuba. He also decides that the submarines the Soviets will send in to protect the ships with these strategic cargoes, they will have nuclear-tipped torpedoes. So Khrushchev's initial reaction to learning that the president at least is drawing a line was not to back down. He actually had an opportunity at that point. The first strategic missiles hadn't been offloaded from any ships at the time the president drew the red line. But something will happen that's quite different after John Kennedy gives his speech on the 22nd of October. I want you to listen to two segments now that show you that the president directly projected to the world and to his own family that the United States might be going to the brink of nuclear war in order to get the missiles out of Cuba. So let's listen to the next segment, please.
And I really do think that the crisis gets...
I want the second October 22nd segment, please, Andrew. And then I would like the Jackie Kennedy. There we go.
My fellow citizens, let no one doubt that this is a difficult and dangerous effort on which we have set out. No one can foresee precisely what course it will take, or what costs or casualties will be incurred. Many months of sacrifice and self-discipline lie ahead, months in which both our patience and our will be tested, months in which many threats and denunciations will keep us aware of our dangers. But the greatest danger of all would be to do nothing.
The Soviets had not anticipated this. And when Khrushchev got the text of the speech, translated, of course, the resolve the Americans showed was very, very concerning to him. What the president said publicly was not for show. This wasn't theater. He meant it. And let's listen to the First Lady recall her discussions with the president the weekend before the president made this speech. Next segment, please.
And I remember saying, well, I knew if anything happened, we'd all be evacuated to Camp David or something. And I don't know if he said anything about that to me. I don't think but I said, please don't send me away to Camp David. You know, me and the children, please don't send me anywhere. If anything happens, we're all going to stay right here with you. And, you know, and I said, even if there's not room in the bomb shelter in the White House, which I'd seen, I said, please, then I just want to be on the lawn when it happens. You know, but I just want to be with you, and I want to die with you, and the children do too, and live without you. So he said he wouldn't send me away. I mean, he didn't really want to send me away either.
The Kennedy family was taking this seriously. The president was projecting that the United States would go to the brink. This is not what the Soviets expected at all. I agree with Mary that the comparison with Ukraine is a flawed one. Though one similarity might be that President Putin underestimated Joe Biden. He certainly underestimated the German leadership and NATO leadership. But what's so interesting about the crisis is that neither leader wanted war. We heard Robert McNamara say that John Kennedy didn't want war, Khrushchev didn't want war. The Cuban missile deployment was part of a psychological struggle for him. He wanted to alter American thinking so that the Soviets could force change. But he never wanted his bluff to be called. John Kennedy had called his bluff. And so when you look at the Soviet documents of the period, the first person to talk about an off-ramp is Nikita Khrushchev. Off-ramp is a term we use these days about Putin. It's Khrushchev who 3 days after Kennedy's speech says to the members of the Politburo Presidium, we've got to find a way out of this. Why? Because of American resolve. Now, they don't end the crisis at that moment, because Khrushchev wants to end it in a way that saves face as much as possible. But what's so striking about Soviet records is that the backing down happens unilaterally in the Politburo because of the fear of nuclear war, because they never wanted nuclear war. They never wanted war, which is a big difference from now because Russia did want war. It's in the middle of a war. It's not an issue of avoiding a war. Russia's opportunities not to have a war, it ignored before February 24th. So it's a big difference between the two. But what's so striking in the Cuban case is the extent to which what ultimately happens, and we'll discuss this in our general discussion and then with you, is the extent to which two leaders who come at this crisis for different reasons both have a sense of humanity. They do not want, even if it means losing face, they do not want to be responsible for, to use President Biden's term, Armageddon. As we start our general discussion, we have a few minutes before we go to Q&A. I'd like you to listen to McGeorge Bundy at a previous library event talk about how his understanding of the importance of the Cuban Missile Crisis would only grow with time. Sadly, of course, he can't be with us. He's no longer with us. But he would later study the crisis as a historian and always think about it as a participant. Could we listen to the McGeorge Bundy clip, please?
He was determined to try to avoid war.
Can we, not that one,
in connection.
Can we have the
with
McGeorge
Cuban
Bundy?
Missile Crisis. Neither he nor others of us knew how dangerous that situation was.
Andrew?
We knew it was dangerous.
Andrew, the Bundy, please. Thank you. It's a really wonderful. McGeorge Bundy, in a sense, is prefiguring. Well, if not, if we don't have it, that's fine. We'll go to a general.
And I really do think
There we go. Thank you.
that the crisis gets larger and not smaller as you look back on it, and the turning point it represents is more important. We haven't been near that level of danger of open conflict between the USSR and the USA since. And you can think of all sorts of secondary reasons for that result, but I think the primary one is the public memory of both governments of what that kind of danger feels like.
I don't want to throw to our panelists. What do we think about the public memory of that crisis right now in Europe, as Europe faces the greatest crisis, really, since the end of the Cold War?
Well, I'll chip in. Just three things, really. One, the point you stressed about the significance of continued resolve. Two, a high sensitivity to avoiding all the pathways that could lead to inadvertent and unforeseen escalation. And there are a number of those in the missile crisis. And people who study the missile crisis are very aware of how this shows all the different ways the military forces could create dangers the leaders had not understood. So first, the significance of resolve. Second, the challenge of understanding, truly understanding the nature of your military deployments and the ways those could be perceived, and the problem of control. And then the third is also the continued significance of diplomacy. What Mary described as the pivotal meeting between Dobrynin and Robert Kennedy on Saturday, October 27th, was actually not pivotal. They did not have a negotiation. Robert Kennedy delivered an extremely somber warning and then an assurance that to take the Jupiter missiles off the table, not have a negotiation about them. But in any case, news of that meeting arrived at the Soviet Presidium after Khrushchev had already made up his mind to give in and announced that decision to the Soviet Presidium. And he had done that, though, partly because of resolve, partly because of the heightened dangerousness, including inadvertent escalation, that had been displayed on Saturday, October 27th, as the Soviet forces shot down a U-2 and killed an American pilot in a situation that Khrushchev had not authorized. And that was only one of several things that happened that day, as fighting generally began over the skies of Cuba. And third, there was diplomacy, but the diplomacy was President Kennedy's outreach to basically accept the deal Khrushchev had offered the previous day that hinged on a pledge not to invade Cuba, which was something that in several different ways Kennedy had indicated, had already decided he wasn't going to do anyway. Kennedy thought that making that concession on not invading Cuba was an easy concession to make because he was playing for much bigger stakes, which were the stakes on Berlin. Do you remember the clip that Tim played where President Kennedy was explaining how these missiles were going to be unveiled in November and that was going to be so important? What President Kennedy did not explain in that interview is that he knew something else was going to be unveiled in November. Khrushchev had told Kennedy again and again that he was going to bring the Berlin crisis to a final resolution in November after your congressional elections. He even, talking to Stuart Udall, said, "There was a time when we would have been fearful of you, but if you try to make a problem this time, we'll swat your ass." That's a direct quote of what Khrushchev said to President Kennedy's emissary in Petsunda in August 1962. And then during the crisis on October 18th, the Soviet Foreign Minister, Gromyko, reiterated that threat to Kennedy that they were going to bring the Berlin thing to a conclusion clearly in November. So when Kennedy tells you that these missiles would have been unveiled in November and that would have changed the political situation, that's part of the equation. So when he makes the move to use diplomacy to resolve the crisis with the non-invasion pledge over Cuba, he's balancing diplomacy along with the resolve and along with the sensitivity about trying to avoid an inadvertent escalation. And I think those 3 points still resonate today.
Thank you. Anybody else want to chime in?
Jump in.
Anybody?
I'll just jump in. I think I worry as a professional worrier that what the Cuban Missile Crisis was and what the stakes were is really not very well understood by lots and lots and lots of people. Folks around this table understand it. But I ask any of my Harvard Business School students or many of my colleagues, and they can't tell you really what it was. They've heard of it. So, Mr. Bunting saying that this will live on and serve a valuable purpose in collective memory, I think that may have been true up to 1990 or 1995 or even possibly the millennium. I don't think so anymore.
Dan, you wanted to say something?
Yes. Tim, remind me if I'm wrong, but I think you asked the question at the beginning of views, ours and others, of the actual risks involved in the crisis. Am I right?
Yes.
Either.
Please. Yeah.
Anyway, let me comment on that in any case. I was aware in 1962 and I knew as I went to the Pentagon to take part in these working groups, I was aware to an unusual degree of how much the United States was superior in terms of numbers and deployments in strategic terms in the world to the Soviet Union. I knew that in 1961, at a time, a month after the Commander-in-Chief in Strategic Air Command in Offutt, Omaha, had announced to me through his chief of warplanes that the Soviets had 1,000 missiles aimed at us at a time when we had 40 or plus our Polaris submarines, our many weapons on carriers, our cruise missiles, our bases in Europe, but 1,000 to 4. And a month later, we had learned through our satellite reconnaissance that what they had was not 1,000, and it was not the 160 that the intelligence people in Washington were mentioning, much lower, but 4. 4, essentially nothing. Again, with 4, you could decapitate Washington and Offutt. But again, with the delegation, that would have no effect on our fighting afterwards. The plans did not require constant centralized control anywhere. So I went then to Washington on 60 years ago tonight with the belief, which I retained throughout the crisis, that there was essentially no possibility of the Soviets initiating nuclear war. The president gave the impression with his description of offensive missiles that could have no other purpose than an offensive capability against the United States, that he really was talking about an ability to launch a surprise attack on the United States. Nearly everyone drew it that way. I knew that this was essentially not totally insignificant, but basically negligible addition to his minor, pretty much insignificant ability to initiate war against the United States compared to our ability not only to initiate war, but even to retaliate. I had drafted the words which turns out, I have to say, part of my confession, which is the subtitle of my book, that I had drafted the words a year earlier for Secretary Kilpatrick to say to the Russians and the world that our ability to retaliate to a Soviet best executed surprise attack was larger than their ability to strike in a first strike. And that was taken as a humiliation by them, had various effects. Was responded to the next day by Khrushchev and by Malinovsky, their chief minister, saying, we are not intimidated. And indeed, that was one factor among others that figured in Khrushchev's desire to even that balance a little bit, by moving some of his existing MRBMs across the ocean to be closer to us. He could have done that with hundreds, in which case it would have made quite a difference. 40, not many, but a symbolic difference. And I have to admit, and it is a big admission, that as I've said in my book, I greased the skids in the fall of '61 toward a missile crisis, though not, I think, on the side of the main reason for his attacking. What I'm saying, though, is that I did not go there in the mood of most of the rest of the world, which was that there were great dangers at that time of our warlike actions in the Caribbean, namely blockade, which was a clear-cut act of war, that might lead to a legal but very aggressive response from the Soviet Union. Bertrand Russell, understandably, was entirely worried that Khrushchev would respond to that with a first strike against the United States, and wrote letters to both heads of state to that effect. They should refrain from responding in this understandable but dangerous way. I felt there was no chance of that. And in that respect, I was right. I also thought in the course of the war, with our enormous conventional superiority in the Caribbean, that again, there would not be, he could not really manage to go to a conventional war with us in the Caribbean. In short, that Khrushchev had to back down. And I retained that throughout the crisis. So working hard as I was night and day, I slept 2 of the 6 nights I was there on a couch in Secretary Nitz's office for a few hours sleep each night rather than going back to my motel. And hard work, but not in great feelings of danger. It turned out that, as you all know, I think, moods of how dangerous the crisis was have evolved and fluctuated back and forth a number of times over the years. And really, for example, 25 years later, in 1988, George Bundy, the then National Security Assistant, wrote a very magisterial book on nuclear danger, in which he concluded that for the reasons that Tim Naftali pointed out correctly, and Phil Zelikow, that neither leader had any desire, any intention of going even to conventional war, let alone nuclear, lest the conventional escalate to nuclear war. And neither of them wanted either a nuclear war or, therefore, a conventional war, despite the fact that they were both making precise threats of doing just that and making every preparation to do just that. If those were bluffs, I said at the time, they sure fooled me, and they were bluffs. And they did fool each other, actually. They fooled many people. There was almost nothing they could have done to assure a war on Tuesday. What would that have been? October 31st or so? Let's see. 27th, 28th, 29th, October 30th was the likely time for the war. There was little they could have done for a war on October 30th that they didn't do. So looking at it, these were very expensive and carefully supported threats. And yet, as they say, I believe they were essentially bluffs and that they had to back down. When Khrushchev did back down on the 30th, my feeling was not of great relief. I thought, well, yeah, that's what I expected. And that wasn't wholly held by everyone. But as they say in 1988, in his book on nuclear war, George Bundy said, really, we thought at various times the war was probably high, other times not so high. Now I have to assume that it was very low because both leaders were determined not to go to war, let alone nuclear war, and that was true. That premise was true. And therefore, there was not a negligible risk because, as he carefully pointed out, any risk of nuclear war is very significant. Nevertheless, it was a very low risk, not negligible, but very low. I believe he was very wrong. 25 years after, more than 25 years after the crisis, and many other people then.
Dan,
yes.
Dan, I think we should turn to questions.
Okay, may I just sum that up in 2 minutes? I think now their intention was very low. The guess that meant the risk was low was based on the idea that they both had perfect control, not only of their own actions, but their subordinates. They knew that was wrong, but it was much more wrong than they realized. Their control, they greatly overestimated their control, both over their allies in the case of Khrushchev and their subordinates in the case of both of them, their lower commanders. And the result of that was, with the risk-taking behavior, which was a preface in their minds to haggling and affecting the terms of a negotiated outcome, in fact, raised the risks extremely high. It's by an almost miraculous event that we escaped a nuclear war that would have kept us from existing. Thank you.
Thank you, which is a good reason why the Soviets were upset. Let's turn to questions from those of you watching on the web and those of you who are in the audience. Those of you who are in the audience, please go to the microphones so that people at the web can hear you. And questions from the web, I believe we have a system by which they will come to the microphones. Yes, you first.
I'm Peter Metz. I live in Needham, and I'm part of Massachusetts Peace Action, and I've been looking forward to this. About 9 months after this incident, a little less, John Kennedy gave a very, very remarkable speech at American University on peace. Most of the world ignored it. I suspect you presidential historians know all about it. In which he described the terrors of nuclear war and the need for the United States to adopt a new attitude, to assess our attitude towards the Soviet Union and our attitude towards peace. So I have two questions for you. One, what if President Kennedy...
Just one, if we could have, because there are other people waiting, just one question, please. Your favorite question.
Well, my favorite question is, what if President Kennedy had lived? Do you think he would have done with that sentiment? Of course, he only lived about less than 6 months later.
Mary, would you like to think about how the international system might have changed had President Kennedy not been shot in Dallas?
You're going to toss that massive counterfactual to me, Tim?
Yes, I am, because I admire you so much. And you've thought about, anyway, I'm going to prejudge what you say.
Obviously, it's obviously the question is a huge question that has obviously intrigued generations of scholars. The only serious answer can be we don't know. I do think what we do know is it is a great tragedy that President Kennedy, having gone through the very steep learning curve of the Cuban Missile Crisis, as president, an experience that was unique to that man, to that person, having gained wisdom from that. And I see Nancy nodding as well. I know Nancy has written a lot about how leaders are formed, and going through crises is part of how that happened. Having gained that wisdom from that very steep curve, how tragic it was then to then lose that wisdom. And I think the questioner has rightly, the questioner from Mass Peace Action, and thank you for your work on behalf of Mass Peace Action. I think you rightly pointed out that there were hints in the American University speech of a different way forward. But exactly what that would have been is hard to say, but what is clear is a great tragedy for that, among many other reasons, that we then lost the president so soon thereafter.
Thank you.
Nancy, did you want to, can Nancy jump in there?
And Nancy would like to chime in, please.
I'll just say, I think one of the things that happened, just to your point, Mary, which I think is spot on, is that Kennedy got more confident in the months after the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I think some of that confidence is part of the American University speech, and I think that all the more reason why that, what if, which we can answer, right, has just a kind of tragic and grave overtone to it, because he was a man getting better as a leader by the middle of 1963.
You, sir.
Jay Fleming, I'm wondering, are there any experiences in the past of Kennedy and Khrushchev that they drew upon to help them navigate their way through this crisis?
Phil, you've thought about this.
Oh, yeah.
Philip?
Yeah. Well, Kennedy had been through serious traumas before, both during of course, during the war, the famous episode, PT 109. He'd been through, he'd already had crisis encounters with Khrushchev, a difficult one when they had met in person at Vienna in 1961. He had been working on issues involving Laos and other problems. He had constantly dealt with trauma and crisis in his personal life, especially his medical conditions. And so he had developed a sense of detachment in managing periods of high trauma and stress that strikes me as remarkable and relates to some of the points about emotional intelligence that Nancy was drawing out earlier. Yes, those came from experiences both as president, but also before his presidency. Khrushchev was vastly more experienced with crisis at the national level. He had narrowly escaped being executed during the period with Stalin. He was a remarkable survivor. He had developed a much more mercurial and impulsive personality than Kennedy had. And Tim, I think, also called attention to the dimension of insecurity that shadows his approach to the whole crisis. Yet I think the fact that he had been through those wars, that he had been a survivor, gave him a fundamental core of unwillingness to take the greatest risks that could plunge his country and the world into the apocalypse, because he knew what an apocalypse might look like. He'd come close.
I'd like to add a domestic experience the president just had. He had just been through the crisis in Mississippi, and in that crisis in Mississippi, he had learned, to his dismay, that even if he ordered the U.S. Army to do something, it might not actually happen, and that the Army would tell him that they could deploy in a certain amount of time, and it would take 3 or 4 times that amount of time for the deployments to get there. And I believe that that was a reminder to him that not only of the fog of war, but that leaders should not assume quick efficiency. And when he asked the U.S. Air Force, how many of the missiles could you take out in a surprise attack? And they said probably 90%. The answer was probably 60%. Next question.
Actually, just one more quick word, Tim. One more quick word.
Sure. Yes, go ahead, Mary.
Also, Kennedy was thinking about World War I and how quickly powers had stumbled into war, and he didn't want to stumble into war in that same way.
Over here, please, sir.
Oh, hi. I was brought up in a New York City school system, so I remember Tuck and Cover, which these huge windows, just like this, which would lacerate me unbelievably, and I would dive under my desk, which would become my funeral pyre. And we were all living in a world of terror at the time. Now, there's two things that I didn't hear. One was how much the Bay of Pigs played into this, and where the hell was Alan Dulles, because he was the monster behind all of this junk. Thank you.
Who would like to? Thank you for your question, sir. Dan, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I'll say, I really strongly think among the things that we had not learned in hardly anyone, except for the president himself, in 1962, was that this crisis did not begin after, you can say it began before, the Bay of Pigs. In fact, what we in the Pentagon called Cuba 1 versus Cuba 2, ever since I've referred to it that way, thinking of the two as being so closely related. The humiliation that Kennedy, having inherited the plan from Eisenhower, that Kennedy and his brother felt over Cuba 1, over the Bay of Pigs. I had gotten the false impression at the time, like I think nearly everyone else, that Kennedy, having taken responsibility for this, he said, you know, success has 1,000 fathers, failure has one. He gave the impression we put that behind us, as he always described it, even to Gromyko. That was a mistake. It's behind us. We won't do that anymore. Castro and Kennedy and Khrushchev, we now know, were sure from that moment on that the Kennedy brothers would revenge that mistake, and that they would do it by using U.S. troops the next time. Now, we don't have enough time to go into this at length now, so let me just say in the most summary way that I believe Kennedy and Khrushchev were essentially right. We in the country were wrong. Bobby Kennedy told people, including my later boss in Vietnam, the former CIA General Edward Lansdale, regime change, we didn't use that term, getting rid of Castro is the highest priority in this country. The Navy was told on making invasion plans in a compartmented way that was kept even from Lansdale, who was in charge of the covert operations, meant to justify an invasion for two different stovepipes, basically, compartmented information, were set to get rid of Castro, and the date was set by Lansdale, coincidentally, for October 20th, before the next election, 1962. And on March 2nd, 1962, March 2nd, 10 days before the flight of the U-2 was March 14th, 12 days later. On March 2nd, McNamara directed that abilities for
October
invasion
2nd.
of
October
Cuba,
2nd. October 2nd.
What did I say?
You said March.
I'm sorry, I kept saying that. On October 2nd, correctly. Directed not only mentioned 6 possibilities under which we would invade, including missiles in Cuba, but including just when the president thought it was necessary, must be entirely ready by October 2nd. That was a directive on which Admiral Dennison immediately acted to prepare using the cover of an exercise in the Caribbean to cover the naval movements, an operation designed openly to invade amphibiously a Caribbean island named Ortsac, which is Khrushchev noticed was Castro's.
Dan, we want to get to the next question.
How much time do we have?
Well, we're over time, but I got permission for us to take one more question. So I want to take one more question. Thank you, Dan.
My question is for Nancy. Your comments, really, Kennedy's personal skills of being able to transfer and change were really interesting. But my question for you, Nancy, is the prepared leadership and the kind of procedural governance of the XCOM. Like, what did they put in place ahead of the crisis, or what was shared in that discerning body that shows even more than Kennedy's exceptional leadership, that goes up and down, according to Phil.
I'm certainly not the resident expert here. Tim, Phil, Daniel, Mary are much more equipped. But I'll say just from a kind of, again, emotional intelligence, self-awareness aspect that I thought setting up the XCOM, which was basically established the day Kennedy discovered the missiles, the day that information was presented to him by Mr. Bundy, that setting that up, and then, as important, right, the way that Kennedy managed that discussion, the meetings he went to, the meetings he didn't go to, but this incredible ability to basically sit back, listen, and in deft ways let an ongoing discussion that rarely turned into dysfunctional dialogue occur over many different days and evolving events, I think, again, shows a high degree of emotional intelligence, high degree of deep self-confidence, and this idea that I don't know exactly what's going to happen next, but I need a lot of different points of view to understand how to navigate this uncertainty and the risks involved.
Thank you, Nancy. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Philip. And thank all of you. This has been, I believe, a remarkable discussion. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have and my colleagues have. I wish you well. Alan?
Thank you, Tim.
It's up to you.
Thank you, Tim, and thanks to all our marvelous experts for this fascinating discussion and for joining us to commemorate the 60th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis. I am grateful that all of you have helped us come to a deeper understanding of the enormously significant challenges of that time, which help illuminate our current time. It is, of course, always my hope that visitors to our library and museum and attendees of our forum series will wonder what might have been had President Kennedy lived a full life and through his presidential terms. And it is my hope that people will consider answering President Kennedy's call to public service. And I think in engaging in this conversation, you've done exactly that, and you are preparing yourselves to do more of that. And so I would thank all of you in the audience for joining us, and I hope you will be able to join us for the next conference session, which will begin at 3 p.m., and will explore the role of intelligence in the crisis and in the present day. Again, thank you for joining us today.